Hey, today is 2.1.1 Apex Algebra 1 Semester 2. We're going to start talking about factors and common factors. So in the last chapter, we were talking about how we actually multiply polynomials and binomials. Now we're going to talk about how we break those apart. Okay, so a common factor is a number or expression that is a factor, I forgot the R here, of two or more numbers of polynomials. Okay, so let's figure out what a factor is. So if I'm looking at the number 6, my factors are numbers that multiply to 6. So 1, 2, 3, and 6 would all be factors because 1 times 6 and 2 times 3 all equal 6. Okay, so we're looking for factors. Okay, so when you have a common factor, we're actually going to find factors of these trinomials. Okay. So greatest common factor is the greatest number or expression that is a factor of two or more numbers. It's often referred to as the GCF. Okay, so if I was looking for, I guess 12, right? So the factors of 12 and 6. So 1 times 6 or 2 times 3. That's a 2 times 3. You can't really see that. And then for 12, it would be 1 times 12 or 2 times 6 or 3 times 4. So my greatest one that they have in common is a 6. So that would be my greatest common factor. So we're going to do the exact same thing when we're factoring polynomials. Okay, so we use the distributive property to multiply factors together to form a product. So here you can see that we have A times B plus C equals AB plus AC. So we just distribute that A to both of these. Okay, so here, if we're looking at it this way, there's a 6x, we multiply it times x, and that's 6x squared, and we distribute it to the 2, so that gives us a 12x. But now we're going to be doing that in reverse. So now we have an AB plus a BC. Well, we have a B in common, okay? So we can factor that B out, and I made another mistake on the sheet here. So we can factor that B out, so it's going to be B times A plus C. So here, if I'm looking at 6x squared and a 12x, well, 6 and 12, I know have a 6 in common, so I can factor out a 6. And this has 1x, this has 2 x's, so they have 1x in common. So if I take 6x squared and 6 divided by 6 is 1, x squared divided by x is just x, and then 12x divided by 6x is just 2. All right, so when we're factoring a greatest common factor, the first thing we're going to do is identify a common factor. And then we're going to use the distributive property in reverse to factor out the common factor. So here we want to factor out the greatest common factor out of 2x squared plus 4x plus 10. So first I'm going to look at the variables. So these don't all have an x. So x is not going to be part of my greatest common factor. But the numbers 2, 4, and 10 are all divisible by 2. So my common factor is 2. So I'm going to factor that out. So I'm going to write it with my greatest common factor first, and then a parenthesis, and I'm going to write whatever's left after I divide. So I'm going to divide this by 2. So 2x squared divided by 2 leaves me with just a 1x squared. 4x divided by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. I did not take an x out, so I'm left with that x. And then 10 divided by 2 is 5. Okay, so that is factoring out just the greatest common factor. Okay, so let's actually take a look at some of these. So the first one in terms of numbers, so the greatest common factor. So here these have a 3x and a 6. So my greatest common factor is going to be a 3. So when I factor that out, so 3x divided by 3 is just x, and 6 divided by 3 is 2. And if I were to multiply this 3 back in, I would get 3 times x, which would be 3x, and 3 times 2, which would be 6. Okay, so this one right here is variables, so I'm going to factor out an actual variable. Okay. So here I have 3 x's, so this is x times x times x. X squared is x times x, and then that's just x. So these all have one x in common. This one has one, this one has one, and this one has one. Okay, so my greatest common factor is going to be 1x. So when I factor that 1x out, I had 3 and I took 1 out, so now I'm left with 2. I had 2, I took 1 out, so now I'm left with 1. And I had 1 and I took it out. Well, remember that I'm really dividing by itself. So any number divided by itself is the number 1. Okay, so I say, whenever I'm talking about variables, I say I take 1 out. But remember, I'm really dividing. So this would be x to the third divided by x. And so yes, I'm taking 1 out, but I'm really dividing by itself and getting the number 1. So here, when I take an x and I divide by itself, I get the number 1. Okay, now let's look at expressions. Okay, so now I have a 2 and a 10. So they both have a 2 in common. This has 2 x's. This has 1x. So they both have 1x. So now when I factor that, my greatest common factor is 2x. Okay. And if I have a 2x squared divided by 2x, 2 divided by 2 is 1. X squared divided by x. Okay, so this is an x times an x. So I'm going to cancel one of them out, and I'm left with an x. Now I have negative 10x divided by 2x. Negative 10 divided by 2 is negative 5. And I had an x, and I took 1 out, so there's no x's there. All right, so here I have a polynomial, and then I'm going to have a factor times a factor. So my b value is the coefficient of my variable, okay, or my x term. Okay. This is my constant of my polynomial. Okay. And these are the constants of the factors. So those are the parts we're looking for when we factor a polynomial. So we've just finished factoring greatest common factors. Now we're going to find out how to take something like this and break it apart into 2 separate binomials, or 2 separate factors. All right, so factor by grouping. So when there are 4 terms, we are going to factor by grouping. So we're going to put a parenthesis around the first 2 terms, and we're going to put a parenthesis around the third and fourth term. So we're going to work this while we walk through it. So we're going to put a parenthesis around the first 2 terms, and we're going to put a parenthesis around the third and fourth terms, making sure we keep that sign in with those third and fourth terms. Okay. The next one, it says find the common factor from the first 2 terms and factor it out. So now I'm just going to look at this first one. Okay, so 7 and 21 have a 7 in common. This is x to the third, and this is an x. So they have an x in common. Okay. So I'm going to factor that out, and I'm left with 7x times x squared plus 3. Okay, so 7 divided by 7 is 1. X to the third, I took an x out, so I'm left with an x squared. 21 divided by 7 is 3. I had an x and took it out, which means that would be 3, or 3 times 1, which is just 3. Okay. Step 3, find the common factor from the third and fourth terms, and we're going to factor it out. Okay. We have to always factor out at least the number 1. So in this case, I have a 2 in common. Okay, so I'm going to factor out a positive 2. So 2x squared divided by 2 is x squared, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. Okay, so now what I have here is I have another polynomial, and you'll notice they have this in common. These have to match. If these don't match, you've done something wrong. So that's going to be one of my factors, and my other factor is going to be whatever's outside the parentheses. So my 7x plus 2, and that's why you always have to factor at least a 1, because you have to have some number right here. Okay. So that's my final answer. Okay. So let's go on ahead and try this second problem. Why don't you guys pause this, try it, and then take a look and see if you get the same thing as I get. Okay, hopefully you tried this. So I'm going to put parentheses around the first two terms and parentheses around the second two terms. X third minus 2x squared. They have two x's, in other words, an x squared in common. So I'm going to take an x squared out, and I'm left with an x minus, and here I'm left with a 2. Remember, I always have to take at least a 1 out of here. Well, in this case, these have a 5 in common. So I'm going to take a positive 5 out. 5 divided by 5 is 1x, okay, because that x is there. And negative 10 divided by 5 is negative 2. Hey, if these don't match, I've done something wrong. So now I have an x minus 2. That's one of my factors. And my other factor is what's outside the parentheses there. And that's it. I have now factored this. All right, you guys practice this. Do your homework. Make sure you ask questions. You have to know how to do this. Have a great day.